The dust devils kicked up red ghosts in the canyon's throat, swirling around the scrub oak like restless spirits. Nahima tasted grit and fear, the metallic tang of blood already thick in the air. A fusillade of arrows ripped through the thin cotton of her tunic, one grazing her arm, another thudding into the rock inches from her son, Chaska. The vigilante Sissis, faces masked by bandanas and hatred, poured from the rocks, their rifles barking. They were farmers, mostly men hardened by doubt and loss, fueled by whispers of Apache raids on homesteads further east. Revenge rode heavy on their shoulders. Nahima pulled Chaska tighter, his small body trembling against hers. He was too young to understand the venom in the air, too young to know that the color of his skin made him a target. She'd been trading herbs for flour at the settlement, a necessary risk to keep Chaska fed, since his father had been taken by fever in the spring. Now, that risk had become a death sentence. Then a wagon lurched into the fray, pulled by two mismatched mules. The man driving, Jedediah, the blacksmith from the edge of town, was a familiar figure, a solitary man, his face etched with a sorrow deep as the canyon itself. He usually kept to himself, the clang of his hammer the only sound breaking the silence around his forge. Jedediah had seen it all and on from the ridge above. The ambush meticulously planned, the gleam of sunlight on rifle barrels. He should have kept driving. He had supplies to deliver, debts to pay. But the sight of the woman shielding the boy, it cracked something open inside him. A wound, he thought, had long since scarred over. The boy's eyes, wide with terror, mirrored the last time he'd seen his own son, Caleb, before the cholera took him. He hadn't meant to interfere, hadn't meant to invite the fury of the vigilante Saites. But his hands, calloused and strong from years of shaping iron, reacted before his mind could. He hauled on the reins, the mules protesting with a discordant bray, and swung the wagon directly into the path of the oncoming arrows. The volley struck with brutal force. The mules screamed, one collapsing instantly. Jedediah felt the sickening thud of impact, the searing pain as arrows ripped through his shoulder and side. He grunted, a sound lost in the chaos. He slumped forward, the reins slipping from his grasp, his vision blurring at the edges. He saw Nahima's face, etched with disbelief and terror. He saw Chaska clinging to her, his small hand gripping her skirt. He tried to speak, to tell them to run, but only a gurgling sound escaped his lips. The desert air, thick with the smell of sage and gunpowder, now carried the metallic scent of his own blood. He fell, his body a shield against the storm. The world tilted. Jedediah tasted dust and copper, the hot desert sun a brutal weight on his closed eyelids. He was vaguely aware of being dragged, the rough scrape of stone against his back. Then, darkness. Cool, damp darkness. He drifted in and out of consciousness, pain a constant, throbbing companion. He heard hushed voices, Nahima's voice, laced with an urgency he didn't understand. He felt the gentle pressure of her hands, cleaning his wounds, the sting of herbs pressed against his torn flesh. He tried to open his eyes, but the effort was too much. The cave was shallow, a scooped-out hollow in the canyon wall, hidden behind a curtain of wind-whipped mesquite. Nahima had chosen it well. It offered meager protection, but it was the best she could manage. She'd hauled Jedediah's heavy frame inch by agonizing inch, her muscles screaming, her hands raw and bleeding. Chaska, though small, had helped, pushing from behind, his face streaked with dirt and worry. Now, as Jedediah lay unconscious, Nahima worked with frantic precision. She knew a little about healing, gleaned from her grandmother, a medicine woman. She'd seen enough death to know when a man was clinging to life by a thread. Jedediah was clinging, but barely. She cleaned the arrow wounds with water from her canteen, diluted with a poultice of willow bark, to ease the inflammation. She packed the gashes with dried yarrow, praying it would staunch the bleeding. She'd already used most of her precious water, but she couldn't leave him to die of infection. Jedediah groaned, a low, guttural sound. His eyes flickered open, unfocused. He saw Nahima's face, her dark eyes filled with concern. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his voice a rasp. Nahima pressed a water skin to his lips. He drank greedily, the cool liquid easing the burning in his chest. "Rest," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need to rest." He closed his eyes again, the pain receding slightly. He saw flashes of the past, unwelcome memories he usually kept buried deep. His wife Sarah, her face pale and drawn. Caleb, his son, coughing, his small body racked with fever. He'd been helpless then, a spectator to their slow, agonizing deaths. He'd watched them slip away one by one, his hands tied by ignorance and circumstance. He'd vowed then to never let himself be helpless again. He'd learned blacksmithing, learned to shape metal, to control the elements. He'd built a life of solitude, a fortress of iron and silence, designed to keep the world at bay. Now, here he was, vulnerable, wounded, dependent on the kindness of a woman he barely knew. The irony was a bitter pill. He opened his eyes again, focusing on Nahima. She was tending the fire, her movements graceful and efficient. Chaska was asleep, curled up beside her, his face peaceful in the flickering light. He watched them, these two survivors, their quiet strength a stark contrast to the barren landscape. He saw the way Nahima's eyes held a lifetime of sorrow, the way she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her circumstance. He saw the love in her gaze as she watched her son sleep, a fierce protectiveness that mirrored his own feelings for Caleb, long gone. He'd come here seeking only solitude, a place to hammer out his grief in the heat of the forge. He'd wanted nothing to do with the troubles of others. But something had shifted in him. Something had cracked open when he saw the fear in Chaska's eyes. He'd seen his own son reflected there, a ghost from a past he couldn't escape. And he had acted. He didn't regret it. Not exactly. But the weight of it, the responsibility, settled heavy on his shoulders. He was a solitary man, ill-equipped to handle the complexities of human connection. He was a blacksmith, not a savior. Yet here he was, his life intertwined with theirs, his fate now inextricably linked to a woman and a boy he barely knew. The silence of the cave was broken only by the crackling fire, the rustling wind, and the unspoken questions that hung heavy in the air. The fire popped, spitting embers into the darkness. Jedediah watched them dance, ephemeral sparks against the vast, indifferent night. He shifted, the movement sending a jolt of pain through his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, the taste of iron heavy on his tongue. Nahima glanced at him, her eyes questioning. He looked away, his gaze drawn back to the fire. He hadn't spoken much since waking, and she hadn't pressed him. The silence between them was thick, woven with unspoken gratitude and a shared understanding of the dangers that lurked beyond the cave mouth. He knew he owed her an explanation, at least a semblance of one. He owed her more than he could ever repay. But words were a foreign currency to him, clumsy and inadequate. He preferred the language of the forge, the precise strike of hammer on steel, the controlled heat that could bend metal to his will. But the fire reminded him. "Sarah," he rasped, the name a dry whisper in the stillness. "My wife, and Caleb, my son." Nahima stilled, her hand hovering over the cooking pot she was tending. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her presence a quiet invitation. He closed his eyes, the images vivid and painful. "Cholera," he continued, his voice gaining a little strength. "Took them both within a week. Back east. Pennsylvania." He saw Sarah's face, pale and drawn, her eyes pleading. He saw Caleb, his small body burning with fever, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He remembered the helplessness, the crushing weight of his own inadequacy. He'd been a farmer then, scratching a meager living from the unforgiving earth. He'd been powerless to stop the sickness, powerless to save his family. I couldn't do nothing, he said, the words catching in his throat. Watched them die. Buried them both. Then I left. He hadn't been able to stay. The farm was a tomb, every corner haunted by their ghosts. He rolled what little he had, packed a few belongings, and headed west. He drifted from town to town, taking odd jobs, numbing the pain with whiskey and hard labor. He found himself drawn to the forge, the heat, the noise, the physical exertion. It was a balm to his wounded soul. He apprenticed himself to a blacksmith, learning the trade, mastering the art of shaping metal. He found a strange solace in the clang of the hammer, a rhythm that drowned out the memories. "Came here," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the canyon. "Looking for quiet, a place to be alone." He built his forge on the edge of town, a solitary outpost against the vast emptiness. He kept to himself, avoided human contact. He hammered out his grief, one piece of iron at a time. He built walls around his heart, walls as strong and impenetrable as the steel he forged. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Nahima's. "Saw you," he said, his voice barely audible. "The boy. He reminded me of Caleb." He looked away again, ashamed of the truth. It wasn't bravery that had driven him to intervene. It was a selfish act, a desperate attempt to rewrite the past. He hadn't been trying to save Nahima and Chaska. He'd been trying to save himself. "Didn't mean to. Didn't think." He trailed off, unable to articulate the tangled mess of emotions that had propelled him into action. He was a broken man, haunted by his past, incapable of love or connection. He was a blacksmith, not a hero. And yet, he had intervened. He had put himself in harm's way for strangers. He had risked everything, for a woman and a boy he barely knew. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. The shadows danced and writhed, mirroring the turmoil in his soul. He was tight, caught between the weight of his past and the uncertain promise of the future. The memory of fire, the memory of losses burned within him. A constant reminder of the fragility of life, the enduring power of grief. He closed his eyes again, seeking refuge in the darkness. The silence of the cave was heavy, broken only by the gentle murmur of Nahima's voice as she spoke softly to Chaska. Their voices a comforting counterpoint to the storm raging within him. The embers pulsed, casting a warm glow on Nahima's face. She stirred the coals with a twig, her movements deliberate, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The silence stretched, comfortable now, no longer burdened by unspoken questions. Jedediah watched her, his pain a dull ache, a familiar companion. Finally she spoke, her voice low and melodic, like the whisper of the wind through the canyon walls. "My people," she began, "call this land sacred ground. For generations we have lived here, hunted here, buried our dead here." She gestured towards the canyon walls, her hand sweeping across the landscape as if embracing it. "The rocks remember our stories, the trees sing our songs, the water carries the tears of our ancestors." She spoke of her tribe, the Wichita, their deep connection to the land, their respect for the balance of nature. She spoke of their traditions, their ceremonies, their unwavering belief in the power of the spirit world. She spoke of a time before the white man came, a time of peace and abundance. Then her voice hardened, a flicker of anger in her eyes. "The Caldwells," she said, the name laced with venom. "They came with their fences and their cattle, their greed and their lice. They claimed this land as their own, stole it from my people. They poisoned the water, slaughtered the buffalo, destroyed our way of life." She told of a generational feud, a bitter struggle for survival. The Caldwells, a powerful ranching family, had long coveted the land where the ambush had taken place, a fertile valley, with a life-giving spring. They had used every means at their disposal, legal and illegal, to drive the Wichita off their ancestral lands. "My father," she said, her voice trembling, "fought them for years. He refused to leave. He said this land was our birthright, our legacy. He died fighting, protecting our home." Jedediah listened, his gaze unwearing. He saw the pain etched on her face, the deep-seated anger that burned beneath the surface. He understood her grief, her sense of loss. He knew what it was like to have everything taken away, to be left with nothing but memories and a burning desire for revenge. He recognized a kindred spirit in Naima, a fellow survivor, forged in the crucible of hardship. He saw a reflection of his own pain in her eyes, a shared understanding that transcended words. He had come to the West seeking solitude, a refuge from his grief. But he had found something else entirely, a connection, a purpose, a reason to fight. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the night. Jedediah felt a stirring within him, a flicker of hope he thought long extinguished. He had spent years wallowing in his own misery, consumed by guilt and regret. But Nahima's story had awakened something in him, a sense of responsibility, a desire to make amends. He had intervened to save her and Chaska, not out of bravery or altruism, but out of a selfish desire to rewrite his own past. But now he realized he had been given a second chance. He could use his skills, his strength, his knowledge to help Naima and her son reclaim their stolen heritage. He could help them fight the Caldwells, protect their land, preserve their way of life. He was a blacksmith, not a hero. But he was a man of action, a man who knew how to shape metal, how to bend it to his will. And he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he could use his skills to help Naima fight for what was rightfully hers. He looked at Naima, her face illuminated by the firelight. He saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering determination. He saw a woman who had suffered unimaginable loss, yet refused to be broken. He saw a mother who would do anything to protect her child. He saw a woman worth fighting for. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy in the stillness. "The Caldwells," he said, his voice firm. "They won't get away with this." Naima turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. "What you mean?" Jedediah met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I mean," he said, "that we're going to fight them. We're going to take back what's yours." A faint smile touched Nahima's lips. "And how do you propose we do that?" Jedediah looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of working the forge. He closed them into fists, feeling the strength in his muscles, the power in his grip. Jedediah's declaration hung in the air, a fragile promise against the vastness of the night. Nahima's skeptical gaze met his, a silent question etched on her face. He knew his words were little more than empty boasts without action. And action, right now, was dictated by their immediate survival. "We need to reach your village," he stated, his voice rough but steady. "Safety in numbers. Strength in knowing the land." Naima nodded slowly, the smile fading. The fire cast dancing shadows on her face, masking the worry that flickered in her eyes. "It is a long ride," she said, her voice low. "And we are being hunted." The journey began before dawn, the first sliver of light painting the eastern sky a pale gray. Jedediah, despite his injuries, insisted on riding. Every jolt sent shards of pain through his shoulder, but he masked it, his face an impassive mask. Naima, perched behind him on the horse, held Chaska tightly, her eyes scanning the horizon, ever vigilant. The landscape was unforgiving, a tapestry of jagged rocks, thorny brush, and sun-baked earth. The heat rose in shimmering waves, blurring the distant mountains. Water was scarce, and the constant threat of discovery weighed heavily on their saints. Jedediah's silence was a constant presence, broken only by the occasional grunt of pain or a clipped direction. He was a man of few words, his thoughts hidden behind a wall of stoicism. But Nahima sensed a change in him, a newfound purpose that burned beneath the surface. She saw it in the set of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze, the unwavering grip on the reins. His wounds slowed them down. Each passing hour etched deeper lines of exhaustion on Nahima's face. She insisted on tending to his injuries whenever they stopped, cleaning the wounds with what little water they had left, and applying fresh poultices of herbs she gathered along the way. "You should rest," she urged him, during one such stop, her voice filled with concern. "Let me take the lead." Jedediah shook his head, his eyes dark with determination. "Can't," he rasped. "Need to keep moving. They won't give up." He knew the Caldwells. Men like that didn't tolerate defiance. They'd see this through to the bitter end, driven by prestige and a thirst for revenge. He'd seen that look in their eyes. The same look he'd seen in his own reflection, years ago. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became unbearable. Chaska nestled between them, grew listless, his small face flushed. Nahima moistened a cloth with water and dabbed his forehead, whispering soothing words in her native tongue. The trail wound through a narrow canyon, the towering walls offering a brief respite from the scorching sun. Jedediah reined in the horse, his senses on high alert. The canyon felt like a trifty, a place where they could easily be ambushed. He dismounted, his movements stiff and deliberate. He examined the ground, searching for signs of pursuit. A broken twig, a scuff mark in the dust, anything that might betray their presence. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice barely audible. "Recently." Nahima's eyes widened with alarm. "How close?" Jedediah squinted, his gaze fixed on a distant ridge. "Too close," he muttered. "We need to move, now." He knew, with a chilling certainty, that their pursuers were closing in. The hope of reaching the village was fading, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. They were running out of time, running out of water, running out of options. He had to make a choice, a decision that could determine their fate. He pointed towards a break in the canyon wall, a narrow opening that led to a steep, winding path. "There," he said, his voice strained. "Shortcut. Leads to the river." The river. Nahima's heart sank. The Washita. Swollen with recent rains, it would be a treacherous crossing. Even in the best of conditions. With a wounded man and a child weakened by the heat, it could be a death sentence. They remounted, Jedediah pushing the horse to its limits. The path was treacherous, strewn with loose rocks and sharp turns. The horse stumbled more than once, nearly throwing them off. Nahima clung to Chaska, her knuckles white, her breath catching in her throat. Finally, they reached the riverbank. The Washita roared past, a churning torrent of muddy water. Debris, branches, logs, even the occasional carcass, swirled in the current, a testament to its raw power. Jedediah dismounted, his face grim. He studied the river, his eyes searching for a safe crossing point. But there was none. The river was too wide, too deep, too fast. He turned to Nahima, his eyes filled with a quiet resignation. "It's no good," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the water. "Too dangerous. You can't cross it with the boy." Nahima stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you saying?" Jedediah avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on the raging river. "I'm saying, you have to go on without me. Take Chaska, head north. You know the way to your village." Nahima gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "I won't leave you." Jedediah shook his head, his face etched with pain. "You have to," he insisted. "It's the only way. I'm slowing you down. I'm a liability." He gestured towards his wounded shoulder. "I won't make it across the river. And even if it, I wouldn't be able to protect you. He looked at Chaska, his small face pale and drawn. He needs you, he said, his voice pleading. He needs to get to safety. You have to do this for him. Nahima's eyes blazed with anger. You think I would abandon you? She cried, her voice rising above the roar of the river. After everything you've done for us. After you risked your life to save us. She stepped closer to him, her eyes locking with his. We are in this together, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. We will survive this together. I will not leave you behind. Jedediah stared at her, stunned by her fierce defiance. He had expected her to argue, to plead, perhaps even to beg. But he had not expected this unwavering resolve, this fierce determination. He saw a strength in her eyes that he had not seen before, a fire that burned brighter than any he had ever witnessed. He had thought her a victim, a helpless woman in need of rescue. But he had been wrong. She was a warrior, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. And in that moment, he understood. He understood that he was not the only one who had been changed by their encounter. He had saved her life, yes, but she had saved his as well. She had given him a purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to live. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and a newfound respect. You're right, he said, his voice soft. We're in this together. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. We'll cross the river, he said, together. We'll make it to your village, together. And we'll fight the Caldwells, together. A faint smile touched Nahima's lips. Together, she echoed, her eyes shining with hope. The decision was made. The river awaited. The fight barely begun. Jedediah scanned the horizon, his gaze hardened. The sun beat down, blurring the edges of the landscape. But he saw them. Riders, tiny specks against the shimmering heat, but riders nonetheless. Vigilantes. And he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that Caldwell was leading them. They're coming, he said, his voice low and urgent. We don't have much time. Nahima's face pallid. Caldwell, she breathed, the name a curse on her lips. He nodded grimly. He won't stop until he has what he wants. He turned back to the river, its churning waters mocking their predicament. We have to cross now. Jedediah began to strip off his shirt, revealing the angry red wound on his shoulder. Nahima watched him, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration. He was injured, exhausted, and outnumbered, yet he stood ready to face whatever lay ahead. He fashioned a makeshift raft from driftwood and vines, lashing the logs together with practiced ease. It was a flimsy structure, barely capable of supporting their weight, but it was the best he could do with the limited resources at hand. Chaska first, he instructed, his voice firm. He lifted the boy gently and placed him on the raft, securing him with a length of rope. Hold on tight, little one. We'll be right behind you. Nahima hesitated, her eyes filled with apprehension. The river looked even more menacing up close, its current swift and unforgiving. But she knew they had no choice. Staying here meant certain capture and likely death. She waded into the water, the icy chill sending shivers through her body. Jedediah followed close behind, pushing the raft ahead of him. The current tugged at their legs, threatening to sweep them off their feet. As they struggled against the current, Jedediah explained the driving force behind Caldwell's relentless pursuit. It wasn't just about the land, though the fertile valley was valuable. It was about revenge. Caldwell's father, Jedediah said, his voice strained against the roar of the river, was killed by your father years ago. A dispute over a property line. Turned bloody. Nahima's eyes widened in shock. She had heard stories, whispers of a feud between the two families, but she had never known the full extent of it. Caldwell, Jedediah continued, has used his father's death to rally the other ranchers. He tells them, Your people are a threat. Savages who will steal their land and kill their families. He's twisted the truth, used fear to fuel his own vendetta. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. He doesn't just want your land, Nahima. He wants your blood. He wants to avenge his father's death. The truth hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't just greed that drove Caldwell, but a deep-seated hatred, a burning desire for retribution. She understood now the depth of the danger they faced. Caldwell wouldn't rest until she and her son were dead. He had spent years poisoning the minds of the local ranchers, painting her people as villains, stirring up old resentments and fears. He'd skillfully exploited their prejudices, twisting the narrative to serve his own twisted agenda. The fear of the Apache, often stoked by sensationalized stories and fueled by land disputes, was a convenient tool for Caldwell to manipulate the community, turning them into a mob, hungry for vengeance. They were halfway across the river now, the current growing stronger. The raft bucked and swayed, threatening to capsize. Jedediah strained against the pull, his muscles screaming in protest. He knew they were running out of time. The vigilantes would reach the riverbank soon, and their chances of survival would dwindle to nothing. The opposite bank felt miles away, the roar of the river deafening. Jedediah risked a glance over his shoulder. The riders were there, silhouetted against the rising sun, their figures growing larger with each passing second. Caldwell, unmistakable in his black hat, led the charge. "Faster, faster," Jedediah urged, his voice hoarse. "We're almost there." Nahima pushed harder, her arms aching, her lungs burning. Chaska clung to the raft, his eyes wide with terror. The river seemed to fight them every inch of the way, its relentless current determined to drag them under. Finally, they reached the shallows. Jedediah stumbled onto the bank, pulling the raft after him. Nahima followed, collapsing onto the sand, gasping for breath. Chaska, trembling, crawled into her arms. "We need to move," Jedediah said, his voice urgent. "They'll be here any minute." They scrambled up the riverbank, seeking cover behind a cluster of rocks. Jedediah scanned the surrounding terrain, his eyes searching for a defensible position. The river offered some protection to their backs, but the open ground ahead provided little cover. He spotted a narrow ravine, a gash in the earth that snaked its way up the hillside. "There," he said, pointing towards the ravine. "We can make a stand there." They raced towards the ravine, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the entrance, a volley of gunfire erupted from the opposite bank. Bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up dust and sending splinters of rock flying. "Get down," Jedediah shouted, shoving Nahima and Chaska into the ravine. He drew his revolver, his movements swift and practiced. He had been a gunslinger once, a man who lived by the gun. He thought he'd left that life behind, buried it deep in the past. But it seemed the past had a way of catching up. The vigilantes charged across the river, their horses splashing through the water. Caldwell, his face contorted with rage, fired his rifle repeatedly, the bullets finding their mark in the rocks around them. Jedediah returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. Two of the vigilantes fell from their horses, their bodies tumbling into the churning water. The others hesitated, momentarily stunned by the ferocity of his resistance. Nahima, despite her fear, grabbed a fallen rifle from the ground. She had never fired a gun before, but she knew how to hold it, how to aim. She had seen her father use one many times, hunting game to feed their village. "I can fight," she said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "Show me what to do." Jedediah nodded grimly. "Aim for the chest," he instructed, his voice calm and steady. "Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it." He showed her how to reload, how to take cover. He had little time to teach her, but she was a quick learner, her movements surprisingly fluid and natural. The vigilantes reached the riverbank and began to advance towards the ravine. Jedediah and Nahima opened fire, their bullets finding their mark with deadly accuracy. More vigilantes fell, their bodies littering the ground. But they were outnumbered, their ammunition dwindling. Jedediah knew it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. He had to buy them time, give Nahima and Chaska a chance to escape. "Take Chaska," he said, his voice urgent. "There's a trail that leads up the mountain. Follow it. It will take you to your village." Nahima shook her head, her eyes filled with defiance. "I won't leave you," she said. "We fight together." Jedediah grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm. "You have to," he insisted. "Chaska needs you. He's your responsibility. I'll hold them off. Go now, please." He saw the doubt in her eyes, the fear, the reluctance. But he also saw the strength, the determination, the unwavering love for her son. He knew she would do what was necessary. With a final, lingering look, Nahima grabbed Chaska's hand and disappeared into the ravine, following the narrow trail that led up the mountain. Jedediah watched them go, his heart heavy with a mixture of hope and despair. He turned back to face the vigilantes, his eyes burning with a cold fury. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and wounded. But he was not afraid. He would fight to the death, buying Nahima and Chaska the time they needed to escape. He owed them that. The remaining vigilantes surged forward, emboldened by Nahima's departure. Jedediah stood his ground, a lone figure against a tide of hate. He emptied his revolver, each shot finding its mark. But more kept coming, spurred on by Caldwell's enraged shouts. Then silence. Jedediah's gun clicked empty. He tossed it aside, the metallic clang echoing in the sudden quiet. He knew what was coming. Caldwell, his face a mask of pure malice, dismounted and strode towards the ravine. "Looks like your luck's run out, stranger," Caldwell spat, his voice thick with venom. "Thought you could play hero. Thought you could stand against me." He gestured to the fallen bodies scattered around the ravine. "All this for a squaw and her half-breed whelp. Was it worth it?" Jedediah didn't answer. He simply stared at Caldwell, his eyes burning with a cold, unwavering intensity. He saw not just a rancher, but a man consumed by hatred, a man who had let the past poison his soul. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "Cat got your tongue, huh? Well, I'll just have to pry it out of you." He spat on the ground. "But first, I'm going to enjoy watching you die." Caldwell charged, a bellow of rage escaping his lips. Jedediah braced himself, his muscles tensing. He knew he was outmatched, weakened by his wound and exhaustion. But he wouldn't go down without a fight. The two men collided, a brutal clash of bone and muscle. Caldwell swung a haymaker, aiming for Jedediah's head. But Jedediah ducked under the blow, his reflexes honed by years of hard living. He landed a solid punch to Caldwell's gut, doubling him over. Caldwell roared in pain and fury, lashing out with a wild kick. Jedediah blocked it, but the force of the blow sent him staggering backwards. Caldwell followed up with a series of rapid punches, each one landing with sickening thuds. Jedediah fought back, his own blows landing with surprising force. He remembered the years he spent working in the forge, the hours of hammering steel, the strength it had built in his arms and shoulders. He wasn't just a gunslinger. He was a blacksmith's son. And the fury of the forge burned within him. They grappled, their bodies locked together in a desperate struggle. They rolled on the ground, trading blows, each man determined to break the other. Dust and sweat mingled with blood, turning the ground into a muddy mess. Caldwell, fueled by years of pent-up hatred, fought with a prideful intensity. He clawed, bit, and gouged, his eyes burning with a fanatical gleam. He saw in Jedediah a symbol of everything he hated: outsiders, do-gooders, and anyone who dared to stand in his way. Jedediah, fueled by a righteous anger, fought with a grim determination. He thought of Nahima and Chaska fleeing through the mountains, their lives hanging in the balance. He couldn't let Caldwell win. He wouldn't let him destroy their future. He managed to get the upper hand, pinning Caldwell to the ground. He rained down blows, each one a hammer strike against Caldwell's skull. Caldwell's resistance weakened, his movements becoming sluggish. Finally, with a final desperate surge of strength, Jedediah landed a knockout punch. Caldwell's eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp. Jedediah collapsed beside him, his body trembling with exhaustion. The remaining vigilantes, seeing their leader defeated, hesitated. Fear flickered in their eyes, replacing the earlier bloodlust. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Jedediah and Caldwell lying in the dust. Jedediah lay there, chest heaving, the taste of dust and blood thick in his mouth. The sun beat down, merciless and indifferent. He could have finished it. He could have ended Caldwell right there, silenced the hate that had driven him for so long. His fingers had instinctively tightened around Caldwell's throat, the familiar urge to extinguish a thread rising within him. Years spent surviving had forged that instinct, hammered it into his very being. But then he saw Chaska's face, small and terrified, clinging to his mother. He saw Nahima's eyes, filled with a strength he hadn't known she possessed. And he knew he couldn't become what Caldwell was. He couldn't let the cycle of violence call him too. With a grunt, Jedediah pushed himself up, his body aching in protest. He straddled Caldwell, who was just beginning to stir, his eyes fluttering open. Caldwell looked up at him, conviction slowly giving way to terror. Jedediah's face was grim, unreadable. He reached down not to deliver another blow, but to unbuckle Caldwell's gun belt. He tossed it aside, the heavy leather landing with a dull thud. Then he took Caldwell's rifle, his father's rifle, the one he had used to terrorize Nahima and her people. He snapped it in two, the sound echoing through the silent ravine. "This ends here," Jedediah said, his voice low and hard, the first words he'd spoken since the fight began. "You won't touch them again." He didn't threaten, didn't curse. He simply spoke the truth, a quiet pronouncement of a new reality. Caldwell, his face bruised and swollen, stared up at him in disbelief. He had expected death, a swift and brutal end. He hadn't expected this humiliation. Jedediah stood up, towering over Caldwell. He didn't offer a hand, didn't offer forgiveness. He simply walked away, leaving Caldwell to lie in the dirt, defeated and alone. He took Caldwell's horse, a fine-looking Appaloosa, and with a hard slap to its flank, sent it galloping in the opposite direction of the fleeing vigilantes' eyes. He knew Caldwell would live, would likely plot revenge. But Jedediah had planted a seed of doubt, a moment of reckoning that might, just might, change the course of things. He had shown the other ranchers, those who had followed Caldwell out of fear and prejudice, that there was another way. He walked slowly back to the river, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and red. The water flowed onward, indifferent to the violence that had stained its banks. He washed the blood from his face and hands, the cold water stinging his wounds. The West was a brutal place, a land of hardship and injustice. But it was also a place of hope, a place where a man could choose his own path, a place where even the deepest wounds could begin to heal. He had chosen his path, and he would follow it, wherever it led. He found his own horse, a sturdy Mustang, grazing nearby. He mounted and turned toward the mountains, toward the trail Nahima and Chaska had taken. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he wouldn't face it alone. The silence of the West was broken only by the soft thud of his horse's hooves, a steady rhythm against the vast, indifferent landscape. A silent promise whispered on the wind. The mountain trail was steep and unforgiving, a relentless climb through pine forests and rocky scree. Jedediah pushed his Mustang onward, his gaze fixed on the faint tracks left by Nahima and Chaska. He knew they were exhausted, their bodies pushed to the limit. He had to reach them soon. He found them huddled beneath a towering ponderosa pine, its thick branches offering meager shelter from the biting wind. Chaska was asleep, his small face pale and drawn. Nahima sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed and haunted. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. Jedediah, she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. You're alive. He dismounted, his movements stiff and sore. He knelt beside Chaska, gently touching his forehead. The boy stirred but didn't wake. They won't follow, Jedediah said, his voice low. I took care of them. He omitted the details, the fight, the mercy he'd shown Caldwell. Some burdens were best carried alone. Nahima looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Thank you, she said softly. For everything. Silence descended between them, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the trees. Jedediah knew something was wrong. There was a weight in her eyes, a pain that went deeper than fear or exhaustion. He waited, letting her find the words. He knew the West had a way of forcing secrets to the surface, of stripping away the layers of pretense and revealing the raw truth beneath. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. There's something I need to tell you. She began, her gaze fixed on the ground. Something about what happened between my people and Caldwell's father. Jedediah remained silent, his expression unchanged. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best thing you could offer someone was a listening ear. Nahima took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping. It wasn't as simple as we made it seem, she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. Caldwell's father. He did start the argument. He trespassed on our land. He threatened our families. But, she paused, her voice choked with emotion. But my father, he struck the first blow. He killed Caldwell's father. The silence that followed was deafening. Jedediah absorbed her words, the weight of her confession settling heavily in the air. The simple narrative he had constructed, the story of innocent victims and ruthless oppressors, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He looked at Nahima, her face etched with guilt and shame. He saw the burden she had carried for so long, the secrets that had poisoned her soul. He understood now the depth of her fear, her reluctance to trust. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked, his voice gentle. Nahima shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I was afraid, she sobbed. Afraid you wouldn't help us if you knew the truth. Afraid you would see us as just as bad as them. Jedediah reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. The truth doesn't change what happened to you and Chaska, he said, his voice unwavering. It doesn't excuse Caldwell's actions. And it doesn't change the fact that you needed help. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. But it does change things, he admitted, his voice softening. It means that both sides carry the weight of the past. It means that the cycle of violence has to end with us. He squeezed her hand. It means you have to forgive your father, he said gently, and you have to find a way to forgive yourself. The West demanded a brutal honesty, not just with others, but with oneself. Nahima pulled her hand away, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of anguish. How can I forgive him? She cried, her voice ragged. He took a life. He started all of this. Jedediah didn't answer immediately. He understood her pain, the seemingly impossible task of forgiving someone who had caused so much suffering. He knew the feeling of being trapped by the past, of being haunted by the ghosts of what had been. His own past was littered with choices he regretted, with moments of violence he couldn't erase. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping across the rugged landscape. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the mountains. The air grew colder, a reminder of the harsh realities of their existence. Forgiveness isn't about condoning what he did, Jedediah said, his voice calm and steady. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of it. It's about refusing to let his actions define you. He turned back to Nahima, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Your father made a choice, he continued, a choice born of anger and fear. But that doesn't mean you have to make the same choice. You can choose a different path. You can choose to break the cycle. He knelt beside her again, his voice softening. It won't be easy, he admitted. Forgiveness is a long and difficult road, but it's the only way to find peace. He looked at Chaska, still sleeping peacefully beneath the pine tree. Think of him, he said gently. He deserves a future free from hatred and violence. He deserves a chance to grow up in a world where the past doesn't dictate his fate. Nahima looked at her son, her expression softening. A tear traced a path down his cheek, and she gently wiped it away. The love she felt for him was a fierce, protective force, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I don't know if I can, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It feels like too much to ask. Jedediah nodded, understanding her hesitation. Then start small, he suggested. Start by forgiving yourself for the guilt you carry. Start by accepting that you can't change the past, but you can shape the future. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. And know that you are not alone, he added. I've made my share of mistakes. I carry my own burdens, but I'm learning to live with them, and I'm here to help you carry yours. He reached out and took her hand again, his grip firm and reassuring. We'll face this together, he said, his voice unwavering. We'll find a way to break the cycle, for Chaska, for ourselves, for the future. Nahima looked at him, her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. She saw in his weathered face a reflection of her own pain, a shared understanding of the hardships they had both endured. She felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of connection that transcended their different backgrounds and experience. She squeezed his hand, her grip tightening. Thank you, Jedediah, she said, her voice filled with emotion. For believing in me, for believing in us. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, plunging the mountains into darkness. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful sound that echoed through the valley. But in the small circle of warmth between Nahima and Jedediah, a seed of hope had been planted. A seed that, with time and care, might just blossom into a future free from the shackles of the past. The darkness deepened, the mountain air growing colder, biting at exposed skin. Jedediah built up the fire, the crackling flames pushing back the shadows, casting dancing patterns on the faces of Nahima and Chaska. The boy remained asleep, oblivious to the turmoil that had gripped his mother's heart. Nahima, wrapped in Jedediah's spare blanket, leaned against the ponderosa, her gaze fixed on the flames. The confession had left her raw, exposed, but also strangely lighter. The weight of the secret, carried for so long, had finally been lifted, shared with someone who understood. Dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pale rose and gold. Jedediah woke first, the ingrained habit of years spent on the trail. He quietly stoked the fire, then moved to check on Chaska, who still slept soundly. He placed a hand on the boy's forehead, feeling for fever. He seemed all right, just weary. Nahima stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She sat up slowly, wincing slightly. Her body was stiff and sore from the arduous journey. Jedediah offered her a cup of strong coffee, brewed over the fire. She accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her chilled bones. We should reach the Apache village by midday, Jedediah said, his voice low. They'll take you in. Nahima nodded, her expression thoughtful. I hope so, she said softly. I hope they'll accept us after everything that's happened. Jedediah met her gaze. They will, he said with conviction. They know what it's like to suffer. They know what it's like to be judged. They'll offer you shelter, and they'll offer you a chance to start over. The journey to the village was slow and arduous, but with Jedediah leading the way, they reached their destination as he predicted. The village was nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by towering cliffs and lush vegetation. It was a place of simple beauty, a sanctuary hidden away from the harsh realities of the outside world. As they approached, they were met by a group of Apache warriors, their faces wary and guarded. They spoke briefly with Jedediah, their eyes scrutinizing Nahima and Chaska. After a moment, one of the warriors nodded, and they were led into the village. The people of the village welcomed them with cautious kindness. They offered them food and shelter, and they tended to their wounds. Nahima and Chaska were given a small dwelling on the outskirts of the village, a simple structure made of mud and wood. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, gradually, Nahima and Chaska began to heal. Chaska, resilient as only a child can be, quickly adapted to his new surroundings. He made friends with the other children in the village, learning their games and their language. He ran and played, his laughter echoing through the valley, a sound that brought a measure of peace to Nahima's heart. Nahima, too, began to find solace in the rhythm of village life. She helped the women with their chores, learning their skills and their traditions. She spent hours weaving intricate baskets, her hands finding comfort in the familiar motions. She listened to the stories of the elders, learning about the history of her people, the triumphs and the tragedies that had shaped their lives. Jedediah stayed on, making no mention of leaving. He used his skills to help the community, repairing tools, hunting game, and tending to the livestock. He was a quiet, unassuming presence, but his strength and his kindness were deeply felt by the people of the village. He spent his days working alongside the men, sharing his knowledge and his experience. But his nights were often spent by the fire, talking with Nahima, sharing stories and dreams. He learned about her hopes for the future, her desire to build a better life for Chaska, her determination to leave the past behind. He saw in her a strength he admired, a resilience that had been forged in the fires of adversity. He saw a woman who had suffered greatly, but who had refused to be broken. He saw a woman who was ready to embrace a new beginning, to forge a new path, free from the shadows of the past. His presence in the village became a symbol, a silent testament to the possibility of mending and starting anew, unbound by old feuds. The past was still there, a raw and painful memory, but it no longer held them captive. They were free to build a new future together, in this secluded valley, far from the hatred and violence that had threatened to consume them. The West, vast and unforgiving, had offered them a sliver of hope, a chance at one evening, as the setting sun painted the valley in hues of orange and purple. Jedediah and Nahima stood together on a small rise overlooking the village. Chaska was playing nearby with the other children. His laughter carried on the gentle breeze. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. They stood in comfortable silence, their shoulders almost touching, a bond forged in hardship and strengthened by shared hope. Nahima gazed at the village below, her eyes filled with a quiet contentment. The past was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer defined her. She had found a measure of peace in this secluded valley, a sense of belonging she had never known before. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Jedediah, for bringing us here." Jedediah nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You belong here," he said, his voice low and steady. "You and Chaskadon. This is your home now." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "You've found peace, Nahima," he said gently. "You deserve it." Nahima looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't have found it without you," she said, her voice trembling. "You seafood us, Jedediah. You gave us a second chance." He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "You saved yourself, Nahima," he said, his voice unwavering. "You had the strength to face the truth, to forgive, to move on. That's something no one can give you. That comes from within." They stood in silence for a moment, their hands clasped tightly together, their eyes meeting in a shared understanding. The setting sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the landscape in a golden light. "What will you do now, Jedediah?" Nahima asked, her voice soft. "Will you stay here with us?" Jedediah hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the horizon. The west was in his blood, the open road a constant call. But something had shifted within him, a pull towards something more than just wandering. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "I haven't decided yet." He looked back at Nahima, his eyes filled with a quiet longing. "But I know I don't want to leave you," he added, his voice softening. "Not now, not ever." Nahima's heart skipped a beat. She had dared not to dream of such a thing, afraid to hope for a future where she wasn't alone. But looking into Jedediah's eyes, she saw a reflection of her own desires, a shared yearning for connection and belonging. "Then stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay with us, Jedediah. Be a part of our family." He squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a quiet joy. "I will," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'll stay." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the skies, they stood together, hand in hand, overlooking the valley. A fragile peace had settled over the land, a promise of a future where their children would not inherit violence, a future built on truth and forgiveness rather than forgetfulness. The West remained wild, untamed, but in that small valley, a seed of hope had been planted, a seed that promised to blossom into a future filled with love, peace, and belonging. The campfire would burn a little brighter tonight. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, a quiet harmony that eased the ache in Nahima's soul. Jedediah, true to his word, remained. He wasn't just a presence. He was a cornerstone, seafoot, and dependable. He taught Chaska how to track game, how to read the whispers of the wind, how to respect the land. He became a father figure, a role the boy embraced with open arms. Nahima watched them, her heart swelling with a gratitude that bordered on reverence. She saw the way Jedediah's calloused hand would gently brush Chaska's hair, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when the boy laughed. It was a love built not on blood, but on shared experience, on a mutual desire for a better future. But the scars, both visible and unseen, remained. Jedediah carried his like badges of honor, etched into his skin, a roadmap of battles fought and survived. They were a constant reminder of the violence he had witnessed, the choices he had made. Yet he didn't hide them. He knew they were a part of him, a part of his story. One afternoon, Chaska, emboldened by curiosity, ran his fingers along the jagged scar that ran down Jedediah's forearm. "How did you get this one, Jedediah?" he asked, his voice full of innocent wonder. Nahima tensed, bracing herself for a story of bloodshed. But Jedediah simply smiled, a faint, almost sad smile. "This one," he said, his voice low, "was from a mountain lion. He was protecting his cubs." Chaska's eyes widened. "You fought a mountain lion?" Jedediah nodded. "I did. But he was just doing what he needed to do, protecting his own." He didn't elaborate, didn't glorify the fight. He simply presented it as a matter of survival, a consequence of living in a world where the lines between predator and prey were often blurred. Later, that evening, Nahima sat with Jedediah by the fire, the embers glowing like fallen stars. "You didn't tell him the whole story," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the flames. "You left out the part where you were hunting the lion for sport." Jedediah sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "He's too young to understand," he said, his voice weary. "There's time for him to learn about the ugliness in the world. For now, let him believe in heroes and monsters. Let him have his innocence." Nahima nodded, understanding his reasoning. But she also knew that Chaska would eventually have to learn the truth, that the world wasn't always as simple as it seemed. "Your scars," she said, her voice gentle. "They tell a story, Jedediah. A story of find, of survival, but also of redemption. Don't be afraid to share that story with him. It might just teach him something important." Jedediah looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He knew she was right. He couldn't shield Chaska from the world forever. He had a responsibility to teach him, to guide him, to prepare him for the challenges that lay ahead. He reached out and took Nahima's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I will," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'll tell him everything, in time. But I'll also teach him that scars aren't just marks of pain. There are also marks of strength, of resilience, of the ability to overcome. And that's a lesson worth learning." The fire crackled, the sound a comforting counterpoint to the silent promise exchanged. In the heart of the unforgiving West, they were building something new, something stronger, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the enduring power of hope.